Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth program of Itasca Water's Practical Water Wisdom series. Thanks for taking the time to attend this session and learn more about your lake and clean water. I'm Stephanie Kessler, and I'll be your host for today's program. First, just a word about Itasca Waters. We are a local nonprofit made up of volunteers who have been active in Itasca County since 2009 to help keep our water clean and healthy. If you haven't done so, you can check out our accomplishments on our website, itascawaters.org. You can also access a whole variety of clean water practices there. Our goal has been to find grants to do research on local water quality and to do educational events such as this to share that knowledge. We have an outstanding lineup of speakers for our series through 2022, presented online at noon on the first Thursday of every month. You can register at itascawaters.org. We thank our partners for making these events possible: the Grand Rapids Area Community Foundation Fund, Minnesota Sea Grant, Itasca Soil and Water Conservation District, Itasca Coalition of Lake Associations, Rapids Radio, KAXE, KBXE Radio, and the Blandin Foundation. Hosting the question and answer section today will be Itasca Waters board member and manager of the Itasca County AIS program, Bill Granchis. The format today will be this. Our speaker, Dr. Chris Filstrup, will first discuss the science behind our topic, blue-green algae, and then he'll give you some strategies and actions you can use at your own property. That will be followed by an opportunity to ask questions. To ask questions, simply click on Q&A at the bottom of your screen and type a brief question into the dialog box. You can do that at any time during our speaker's presentation. And then Bill will read those questions to our speaker during the Q&A section. Similar questions may be combined, and we may not get to all the questions if we run out of time. This program is being recorded and will be available for viewing online through our website, itascawaters.org. Finally, we value your opinion and hope you will complete the evaluation form that will be sent to you by email after today's session. Our topic today is blue-green algae, what causes it and why you should care about it. Our speaker today is Dr. Chris Filstrup. Dr. Filstrup is a lake and stream scientist specializing in harmful algae bloom ecology, nutrient cycling in lakes, watershed nutrient reduction strategies, and freshwater resources management. His research takes him from small farm ponds to the huge Lake Superior. Chris also specializes in working with large data sets to investigate how climate and land use interactions affect water quality in lakes across the continental United States. That is a basic description of Dr. Filstrup's work. Now let's talk about his very impressive resume. Chris directs the Central Analytical Lab, a state-certified water chemistry laboratory. Members of his team specialize in lake and stream monitoring and assessment, high-resolution monitoring instruments, and analytical chemistry. Chris has a postdoctoral from Iowa State University, a PhD in biology from Baylor University, and a BS in biology from the University of Texas at Austin. Now, let's hear what he has to say. Dr. Filstrup, the stage is yours.
All right. Thank you, Stephanie, for the kind introduction. I will share my screen now and we'll get rolling here. All right. And hopefully that looks clear to everyone and we're in the proper mode. But hi, all. I'm Chris Filstrup. It's my pleasure to be with you here today. I'm based in Duluth, Minnesota, so a little closer to Lake Superior than most of you. And it's a beautiful day here. So I hope it's a beautiful day where you are. And thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to come hear about blue-green algae. So before I get into kind of the state of the science of blue-green algae and ways that you can help prevent them, I wanted to just talk a little bit about what blue-green algae are. Blue-green algae, this is an image showing colonies of the Phanozomenon, which are really characteristic in lakes. So if you're out there on your lake and you see what looks like a lot of clumped grass tufts sticking together, that is likely a type of a Phanozomenon. So they're really, really interesting looking. So blue-green algae are also called cyanobacteria. And why we call them blue-green algae is because the cyanobacteria that we're going to be speaking about today in the lake, the open waters of lakes, actually function like algae, like diatoms, green algae, and other types of algae in that they're photosynthetic. So they use photosynthetic pigments to produce their own food source, and that way they sit at the base of food webs of lakes. So that's why they got the name blue-green algae. But when we started looking back into what the phylogenies of bacteria, they are actually, or cyanobacteria, they are actually bacteria. So Microcystis, which is a type of blue-green algae, or cyanobacteria, is more closely related to an E. coli than it is to a green alga. And if you look at the panel on the right, this shows you some of the beautiful morphologies of cyanobacteria. There's everything from amorphous colonies that look like little clumps of cells sticking together, like this Microcystis colony here, all the way till these long filament colonies that are more linear in shape. And there's also single-celled varieties as well. So some of you may be thinking, well, are cyanobacteria new? Because I'm hearing more about them in the media, and they are not new by any means. So cyanobacteria go back on this earth 3.5 billion years, and they were some of the first forms of life on earth. They were also the first organisms to undergo photosynthesis. So they are responsible for creating oxygen in the atmosphere that we see today. So they're not new, but we're hearing more about them. And they also colonize just about every environment on the planet. So today we're going to be focusing on lakes in your lakes, but we also see them in the moist terrestrial environments and other environments as well. And I want to start by saying we tend to think of cyanobacteria in a negative way, and that's when they become a problem. But cyanobacteria are a part of healthy algae or phytoplankton communities in lakes. So this plot is just showing the seasonal succession of different types of algae within lakes, starting with after ice off. And in lakes, you tend to see this pattern where you see the growth of diatoms in a spring bloom. But as temperatures become warmer and those diatoms begin to settle out of the water column, you tend to see a replacement of those communities more and more by cyanobacteria and also other types of green algae during those really hot summer months. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is in a second. But again, the reason we tend to think about cyanobacteria is when they become unbalanced in an ecosystem or a lake. So why should you care about cyanobacteria? So I look at this image of this person standing on a dock holding their nose, and this immediately screams to me, this is probably not a place I want to be. And hopefully your lake that you're on today or near today doesn't look like this. But this is when you have a cyanobacteria bloom and you see the water looks really green and dense and almost turquoisey streaks on the top. Those are surface scums of cyanobacteria. And in addition to being unsightly, they can be harmful as well, which is why we call them harmful algal blooms, because they produce a variety of toxins that can make people sick and also has the ability to kill pets. So this nice placard on the left side of the screen is from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And their motto is when in doubt, stay out. So you can see the two boys in the upper right panel who have just gone swimming in a lake with a cyanobacteria bloom, and they come out with all this cyanobacteria on their bodies. Same thing happens to pets as well. So if you can pick up like the surface water in your lake and it looks like green paint, that's probably something that you want to be concerned about and potentially limit your recreational activities within that lake. But MPCA has a whole host of the highest risk, which is when you want to keep children and pets out of an algae bloom with present. And then they have recreational limits as well as fish consumption advisories that they have put together for the public. And so we know a lot about cyanobacteria from systems. So it's really a problem that we've known about for some time. So this is an image of Lake Erie. So on the other end of the Great Lakes from where we are right now. And Lake Erie is kind of the poster child for having these annual recurring cyanobacteria blooms. And one of the challenges behind that is that the city of Toledo and surrounding communities get their water from Lake Erie over here near Toledo, Ohio. And there are concerns about that water being contaminated. And I believe it was back in 2014, they had to shut down the municipal water supply for a week because of cyanobacteria contamination of that water supply. So those are kind of that's a really good example of an existing concern. Something that hits a little closer to home here in Duluth, Minnesota, is that we're starting to see cyanobacteria blooms in the near shore of Lake Superior. And the interesting thing about that is Lake Superior doesn't fit the characteristic profile of a lake where you would see cyanobacteria. So something's changing within the lake that's enabling cyanobacteria to become more prevalent within the lake itself. And that's likely related to climate change. And we'll talk about some of those drivers in a second. But it's definitely a big concern that we're paying attention to up here. So why do cyanobacteria produce toxins? That's kind of the million-dollar question right now. Cyanobacteria toxins are relatively rich in nitrogen, meaning they take a lot of nitrogen to make, and they take a lot of energy to make that could be going towards growth of cyanobacteria itself. So they're taking energy to invest into these compounds for a specific reason. So they're being made for a reason, but we still don't know what those triggers are all that well. And people have hypothesized what some of these triggers may be. One is that cyanobacteria toxins harm competitors of cyanobacteria or other types of algae. So they are directly related to competition for resources with other types of algae. The other reason could be that they're hurting the zooplankton, which graze on cyanobacteria and other types of algae. So they're a predator defense mechanism. There's been hypotheses about they're used for intercellular communication between cells, just to let each other know, oh, we're building these dense populations right now, so they can sense each other in the environment. And then there's a whole host of other reasons, which I won't get into here, but you can read those on the screen. And the one thing I want to say is, since cyanobacteria have been around for about 3.5 billion years, they've encountered a lot of different environments. And because of this, they've developed numerous advantages that allow them to gain footholds in communities. And when we tend to think about this, I tend to think about nutrient resources and also the physiology of cyanobacteria to help them under different physical stresses. So for nutrients, when we see a lot of nutrients in a lake, we tend to see high growth potential for organisms such as cyanobacteria and algae. Cyanobacteria can undergo they can withstand N limitation by using nitrogen fixation, and also they can respond really rapidly to these nutrient pulses. And they also do well under these really warm conditions, which can be stressful to other organisms and create challenges for other organisms to remain in the water column near where the light source is. And they also have some buoyancy regulation. And I'm going to step through these a little bit really quickly. So Dr. Downing gave a talk earlier this year or this summer for the Itasca Waters program, talking about what nutrient enrichment looks like in lakes. And this is just a schematic showing a Secchi disk at the same depth in a lake. And you can see under more nutrients, you tend to see more algae, and that Secchi disk disappears, so you lose track of it at the same depth as you see more nutrients in that system. The thing I want to point out is, though, with this, you also see a transition from these healthy mixed algae communities over to communities over here, which are dominated by cyanobacteria. So along with losing that really nice blue water and moving towards this soupy, this pea soup green water, you start seeing more and more cyanobacteria in those communities. So with this, you also see phosphorus enrichment. And one of the things that cyanobacteria can do that's really kind of interesting is they have these cells called heterocytes where they can fix nitrogen. So if you're in a system where nitrogen is limiting, you can't grow if you don't have an external source of nitrogen. But what cyanobacteria have done is they have this way to fix nitrogen gas into a form of nitrogen that they can then use to grow. And by doing so, they remove that limitation on their community so they can continue growing where other types of algae can't grow. And this is very similar to what legumes can do in the terrestrial environment, is they have that bacterial association where they can fix atmospheric nitrogen. The other thing we know is that cyanobacteria tend to do better under a warming climate. So one paper that was put out by Hans Perl was called "Blooms Like It Hot." And that kind of title for the paper, which was really clever, kind of stuck. But what we're curious about is, as these lakes are warming and atmospheric temperatures are warming, we're likely to see more and more cyanobacteria blooms going forward. With Minnesota, another aspect of this is earlier ice out. So this is an image of Lake Minnetonka showing the ice out date. And as ice out becomes earlier and earlier within a year, so think about the ice out shifting from this point all the way to over here, these communities start developing earlier. Circulation happens earlier in the lake, and you tend to draw the cyanobacteria communities earlier and earlier, and they have a longer period to persist within those lakes. So we would anticipate that that would lead to more and more cyanobacteria blooms. The other thing that happens is during these warmer temperatures in lakes, you start seeing the lake thermal stratification, the thermal stratification stability in these lakes gets stronger. And what that does is that allows cyanobacteria to actually gain an advantage, because some cyanobacteria can regulate their buoyancy within the water column. So this is an image looking at gas vesicles within a cyanobacterial colony. And under these really stable conditions, cyanobacteria float to the surface. And if you think about canopy effects in a forest, they shade out everything growing underneath them, so those other competitors don't have access to the same light resources that cyanobacteria do. So the perfect recipe for cyanobacteria blooms, I like to think of this as my perfect storm image, right? So if you've seen the movie The Perfect Storm, you know that certain conditions lead to these big challenges. So when you have really stormy conditions, what happens is you get a lot of nutrients running off the landscape or fields or your lawn in these really quick pulses. And what that does is that feeds all the fuel to the lake for cyanobacteria to begin growing. And if you follow that up with an extended, really hot, dry period where there's not much wind, those are the perfect conditions where we tend to see these cyanobacteria blooms take off. And we really get concerned about the potential for toxin production in cyanobacteria during those points in time. So that kind of sets up when we start seeing these cyanobacteria develop, these harmful algal blooms develop, why you should be concerned. But we also want to think about challenges to controlling them in ways that you can help, right? So how can you help? And during this section, I'm going to talk a lot about green infrastructure and stormwater management, because those tend to be approaches where individuals can help at the property level. So what's in stormwater? So if we have a big storm and you're seeing lots of water running off your lawn into roadside ditches or directly into a lake, that's not just water going into the lake, right? So that's nutrients that were sitting on your lawn. So that could be fertilizer, that could be sediments or soil, which are running off of the land or construction areas. E. coli and bacteria are coming off of your lawn as well as a whole host of other chemicals where we're still trying to understand what the impact of those chemicals are on aquatic ecosystems. You can think about things like PFAS, which you've probably heard about in the news, and other forever chemicals get delivered in stormwater. So ways that you can help take care of the problem is by managing the stormwater at the property level. And lots of this is built on green infrastructure. And a simple definition of green infrastructure is basically a nature-based solution to try to restore those natural water cycles. So when we develop property, we're altering the hydrology of the system or how water moves off of the landscape or how it infiltrates into the soil. So what we try to do with green infrastructure is we try to mimic certain things to slow down water, or certain approaches to slow down water. And I put a link to the North Shore Homeowner's Guide to Managing Stormwater. This link will be available. So if you want more information on some of these approaches, this is a really great resource that you have access to. And the other thing I want to say with green infrastructure is really small changes that you do on your own property has a big impact on improving water quality. So as we continue moving through some of these techniques, think about ways that you can adopt some of these policies or practices in your own backyard. One way you can help reduce harmful algal blooms is by reducing nutrient inputs into the lake. So ways that you can help here is fertilize only when absolutely needed. And you can also buy phosphorus-free fertilizer. So this is an image showing the NPK of a fertilizer that you can pick up. Phosphorus tends to be the limiting nutrient in lakes. So as we see more phosphorus entering the lake, we see more and more growth of these harmful algal blooms. So by getting fertilizer without phosphorus in it, you're helping to solve that problem. The other thing is, think about fertilizer application. If you own lakefront property, you don't need to fertilize all the way up until the lakeshore and have some of the fertilizer granules go into the lake itself. You can set a little bit of a buffer strip, and I'll show that in a second. The other thing you can do is pick up grass clippings so they don't enter the lake and then decompose and release nutrients. And also my favorite part of this whole talk is thinking about the poop fairy. So there is no poop fairy to help pick up after your pets. So if you have a dog, dog waste is really high in phosphorus. It has a high phosphorus content, which is a really strange thing to know. But in addition to having E. coli and bacteria and contaminants and things like that, It also has a lot of phosphorus. So if you pick up your dog poop regularly, that makes sure that that phosphorus doesn't run off in the stormwater. The other way you can help is by trying to slow down the water. So rather than having the water go straight off your yard and into the lake, if you slow it down a little bit, that gives natural processes a chance to try to remove some of the nutrients as well. And there's several examples that you can use to help reduce stormwater runoff. You can use rain barrels, rain gardens, shoreline buffers, permeous pavers, and properly maintained septic systems. And I just wanted to show a couple examples of that. I think most people on this call are probably familiar with rain barrels. I know these are a really great way to collect rainwater and then reuse it for your gardens or other watering needs. So think about a big barrel, which is collecting water from a downspout. And the good thing is you can buy rain barrels at your local hardware store, or lots of communities have rain barrel building workshops, which I think I haven't participated in yet, but it's really something on my list that I want to do because I really like the concept of having a rain barrel. And this really slows down and collects the water and allows reuse. If you don't have a rain barrel, you can also put in a dry well. So basically think about a hole in the ground that collects water from your downspout and stores it for a period of time before it can be dissipated through groundwater infiltration or other means. But basically you dig a hole and you fill it with rocks and other media. One of the things about this is you want to make sure it's sloping away from the house so it doesn't start back building towards your house and towards your foundation. I'm a gardener. I don't know how many of you are gardeners, but building a rain garden is another cool way that you can contribute. So think about a depression in the ground that collects water, and then you can plant a whole host of different plants that can tolerate saturated conditions, but also the high variability in going from saturated conditions to non-saturated conditions. And this will help the water infiltrate. It'll help collect it until it can be dissipated. And the plants can also remove some of those nutrients from the soil. So that's another great example. And shoreline buffers, again, think about recolonizing the native shoreline with different plants, native plants preferably. But this is just an example of showing that buffer. And as water runs off the lawn, it'll be trapped for a period of time and slowed down within those buffer strips. You can also use permeous pavers. So rather than having water just sit on these impervious surfaces like asphalt or also brick patios or paver patios, you can leave little spaces between the pavers that allows the water to infiltrate, so it's not directly running off into your lake or receiving streams that eventually move into the lake. This is a little more complex, so you have to be pretty handy to do this, but there are lots of resources, again, at local hardware stores that can help you out with this, and a lot of really good guides online. And finally, just to build off of one of the previous talks, a properly maintained septic system is really critical to making sure that the water being collected by your septic system isn't short-circuiting the system and draining directly into a lake or a receiving stream, and that it has adequate time to be processed and treated before it goes into the lake. And the final point I want to make is that this is a community effort. You are not alone. You are not expected to do the bulk of the work. There is help out there. And lots of communities and municipalities will adopt these similar practices. So reducing nutrient loading and slowing down the water, but on a much bigger scale. So this is an example of a treatment wetland, which has this kind of serpentine pattern. where the water flows throughout the wetland in a sequential fashion. And as it does so, it removes nutrients. So the water leaving that treatment wetland has way less nutrients than the water entering it. And then there's also examples of green infrastructure here in the median of a roadway. And here again is another example of a median in the roadway. Again, but to slow down that water running off the roads and give it ample time to be treated by plants and other natural bacterial processes. So that's basically the presentation today. The take-home messages that I want to get across is, one, cyanobacteria are an important primary producer in the base of food webs. So we have to have that healthy primary producer community within lakes to get a healthy fish stock. If you're an angler out there, we need healthy primary producers to get the healthy fish that we want to catch. But some cyanobacteria under certain conditions can produce these toxins that are really harmful to people and pets. And in Minnesota, we get calls about dog deaths every year, where someone will take their dog to a family member's cabin on a lake, and that poor pet doesn't come home. And those are really tragic situations and really hard for people to deal with. So knowledge is key. And you can help reduce the risk by two things. One, reducing the nutrients running into the lake off of your lawn, but also helping to slow down that water as it moves off the lawn into the landscape. And again, you are not alone. It takes a team to solve these problems. These are really big problems. And, you know, the science still has some answers we need to address to figure out the best solutions. But we do know nutrients are important, and we know temperatures are important. And so at least with the nutrients and water running off quickly and being pulsed into these systems and lakes, this is an area where you can help. And this is an area where your community can help. And I wanted to end with, if you suspect illness from a harmful algal bloom, call 911 if it's urgent. If it's not as urgent, you can also contact the Minnesota Department of Health at the number listed here. Or if you simply want to report these unsightly blooms, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency collects this information every year. And if it is a serious enough occurrence, they will send someone out to come monitor. So you can call that number, or you can also address them at the email listed there. So again, I just want to thank everyone for taking the time out of their beautiful day to come listen to this talk and thinking about ways you can contribute to solutions to helping mitigate these harmful algal blooms. Please feel free to contact me with any questions. My colleague here at NRI and also Minnesota Sea Grant, Tiffany Sprague, has a lot of really good information on green infrastructure and stormwater management. I've listed her contact information here and talked to her. Feel free to reach out to her as well if you have any questions or concerns. And with that, I would love to open it up to questions, and thank you again.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris. I do really encourage people to take this opportunity to ask this incredible expert questions about this topic. So please use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen to type in a question. And I will now turn it over to Bill Granches to host the Q&A section.
Thank you, Steph. Hello and welcome to the question and answer section of today's program. Now, please submit your questions in writing by clicking on the Q&A icon. We will not be using the chat function. I'll read the questions out loud and they will be answered by Dr. Filstrup. We may combine similar questions and we may not get to all of your questions today. So please feel free to email us after the program if you still have unanswered questions. So let's begin. Our first question is, since they act like algae, are blue-green algae useful to living things in lakes?
Yes, most definitely. So they are a food source for zooplankton. So zooplankton are the little crustaceans that eat the algae, and then small fish eat the zooplankton, and bigger fish eat those. So yes, they are part of that healthy primary producer community, which forms the base of the entire food web of the lake, including our fisheries. But again, it's the certain types of cyanobacteria that can produce toxins which are a concern from a public health standpoint. And the other thing I didn't mention is that these blooms of cyanobacteria, once they die, they tend to die all at once and they go to the bottom of the lake. And when bacteria start consuming that organic matter and breaking down the cells, they consume a lot of oxygen, which creates problems with hypoxia, which many of you have probably heard about, are those really low oxygen conditions, which can be stressful to fish. So under certain conditions, they are good, but when we tend to think about them, it's kind of in this unbalanced light when they're having negative impacts.
Okay, kind of a follow-up to that is, what kinds of health problems can cyanobacteria cause to people and pets? And does the water actually have to look like pea soup for it to be dangerous?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I didn't get into it too much, but cyanobacteria produce a whole host of toxins. And those toxins can be simple things like dermatoxins. I shouldn't call them simple, but they can be dermatoxins, which cause you to get an itch, which lots of people tend to think of as swimmer's itch, but it's actually these toxins. So that's kind of a minor reaction that people can have. But the other more serious toxins they produce are hepatotoxins, which damage the liver, as well as neurotoxins, which affect the nervous system. So yeah, they can be a huge problem, and they tend to be high when we see the pea soup looking water in lakes, because we have those big communities which can translate to high levels of toxins. The most critical time, though, that becomes dangerous is after a bloom starts dissipating. When those cells start breaking up, they release all the toxins they have within their cells into the lake. And so the lake may look somewhat clear, but that may be a time after the bloom where you have the highest concentrations of toxins within the lake. So if you're on a lake frequently and you see a bloom, and then the bloom goes away, there's normally a period of time, depending on how quickly water moves through that lake, for the water to clear up. So that's a great point. We kind of use as a rule of thumb, when in doubt, stay out. But there is that critical period after a bloom dissipates, which can also be dangerous.
Boy, the questions are really rolling in now. Next question. This person says that they saw BlueGreen algae in the river for the first time, and this person's up by Ely. Is BlueGreen algae a recent appearance in northern Minnesota?
For some lakes, yes. It really is system dependent. Like thinking about Lake of the Woods, cyanobacteria have been a problem up there for some time, just due to a lot of nutrient loading into the system. But we're starting to see other lakes where they're becoming more and more prevalent. And I think that's likely due to climate change. So as these lakes start warming, they can become more conducive and give the advantage towards cyanobacteria. So in certain lakes, you may start seeing them more and more. Here in Duluth, Lake Superior is certainly an example of that, where one of the most recent blooms that really started concern about cyanobacteria bloom in Lake Superior was in 2018, was one of the most recent one that people remember. But since then, we've started seeing them occur almost every year within the lake. So that's kind of this indication that the lake is changing due to climate. And maybe this is like an early warning indicator for things that we need to be concerned about going forward.
Very good. Next question. If it's in a lake, is it best not to keep any of the fish from that lake at that time?
So say fish are oftentimes safe to eat or consume if they're in a cyanobacteria bloom. So normally the toxins, the mode of action is that you'll either have hepatotoxins, which will concentrate in like the liver and organs of fish, not in the flesh or fillet, or you can also have neurotoxins, which will concentrate in the brain. So oftentimes it is safe to eat the fillets, but you just want to be really careful about discarding the internal organs and brains and things like that. And, probably not making a delicacy out of those. I think the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency advice on that is, just use common sense when it comes to that. But normally the fillets are safe to eat.
Next question. How important is native vegetation for maintaining shade in the littoral zone to help water stay cool?
Oh, yeah. I love thinking about aquatic plants and macrophytes because in addition to that, what they also do is they help sequester some of the nutrients and they use it before the cyanobacteria or other algae can get to it. So in lakes, you tend to have these two alternate stable states, one being relatively clear waters where you have a lot of plants or aquatic macrophytes, and the other being these really turbid systems where you have like really reduced clarity in the lake and a lot of cyanobacteria growing in the upper water column and no plants. So I would much rather have the former, where you're having clear water and these healthy plant communities, which also provide good fish habitat, rather than these other systems which are dominated by the really turbid algae green waters. So yes, having a healthy plant community and a healthy littoral zone is really good in helping to solve this problem. And I often used to talk about reestablishment of those healthy plant communities when I was talking with different communities in a previous job I had, when we were thinking about restoration strategies for the lake to get those lakes to where the community wanted them to be. Clearer water, better fisheries, better habitat, increased oxygen levels. So yes, macrophytes are a critical part of that.
Are there any emerging localized treatments for these blooms?
Normally, these are being conducted at the watershed scale, just because you have to think about the size of the lake and the scale of the problem and what it would take to solve that with in-lake treatment. There are in-lake treatment options out there, and there's a lot of science being conducted on that right now. I know I was just chatting with a colleague yesterday about some of the research being conducted in the Twin Cities, where they're looking at using like rock flour or sediment or increased turbidity to try to limit light penetration in these lakes to reduce the amount of cyanobacteria that can grow. There's also dyes that people use on smaller lakes and kind of more personal ponds to help reduce growth of plants and algae and things like that. But the problem is those don't really scale up all that well. You can use them on smaller systems, but when you start talking about bigger lakes, the economy of scale just isn't there yet. As well as, sometimes you're not addressing the cause of cyanobacteria, which can differ depending on the type of lake you're in. So yes, there are some techniques out there. You can Google them and you will see a lot of silver bullet solutions people are trying to sell you. But there are limits on the efficacy of those different techniques.
I see. Okay, this is kind of, we asked about the effects of eating the fish or should we eat the fish? But here's a question. If I use water from a river to water my garden that has blue-green algae in it, can I safely eat the produce?
Yeah, there's been a couple studies that have actually looked at watering in like big agricultural fields in California. And there was one study that did show detectable levels of toxins in like lettuces and things like that. But that was one study from one example. So I don't want to use that as the only example, because there's been lots of other studies where they haven't found any kind of toxin transfer from watering. So I think you just really need to be cautious, right? So if water is really green like that, maybe you want to start thinking about limiting some of the watering on your garden, but there really isn't conclusive evidence right now that you're going to see those toxins being transferred to your lettuces and then transferred to the body. There's just too many unknowns right now, unfortunately.
Okay. You mentioned that the blue-green algae tend to die off all at the same time, but is there a lifespan, a typical lifespan for blue-green algae?
Yeah, so these things can replicate very quickly, like in the matter of a day, like 1 day to 3 days, which is why when you start seeing these big pulses of nutrients coming into a lake, some of the things that can respond rapidly are cyanobacteria, just because they can have that explosive growth pattern. And then you can see them set up in certain lakes and they seem to persist throughout the year. But there's normally a trigger that ends those blooms. And that's called the senescence period of the bloom. But basically, think of it as the bloom dying off. All those algae are responding to a similar trigger, and they just die because conditions aren't favorable for them to grow anymore. So that's when we tend to see those big die-offs, and you can see clear waters after that. But again, it really is system specific. Sometimes they persist throughout the entire year and then die off at the end of the season. And other times they're more ephemeral or transient in a lake.
I see. Well, with the water temperature increasing and favoring these blooms, what if you have a deep lake? And are these cyanobacteria just going to be limited to the littoral zone, or will some part of it drift off into the deeper, colder waters of the lake?
Yeah, so these things are really variable, and they tend to stack up on the downwind side of the lake along the shoreline. So remember, these things can control their buoyancy so they can float to the surface. And when they do that, wind and wave action can push them to a certain shoreline. But then when you start seeing the wind shift in direction, right, they'll be pushed back the other way. So these blooms are really spatially variable within individual lakes. So yeah, they can certainly develop in the warmer nearshore waters and then be pushed offshore in a lake. That happens all the time. So you may talk to your neighbor on the other side of the lake and they're like, oh, we have this cyanobacteria bloom and our waters are really green and gross. And you may be like, what are you talking about? The water looks perfectly clear over here. And then if the winds shift, you may have the total opposite conversation the next week. So they move around quite a bit.
Okay. Probably the last question we have time here for. Are these particularly more toxic to smaller animals, or are they equally toxic to all size animals?
Yeah, so again, that's it really depends. I mean, they are toxic to all size animals, but if you think about how much you're ingesting relative to body mass, that plays a big factor. So if you think about like milligrams of cyanobacteria per kilogram a person, a bigger person would have a much lower dose than like a real small person, right? So those smaller creatures can be more sensitive to them and start showing the effects first. So if you think about a potential fish kill happening or something like that, it may be those smaller larvae or more sensitive fish that you start seeing die first before you start seeing the bigger ones. So size definitely has an impact. But again, that's also going to depend on the potency of the certain toxins. Like hepatotoxins take a while to have an impact on an organism because they really need to accumulate in the liver and then show those liver lesions and start having health effects. Whereas something like neurotoxins, which concentrate in the brain, are way more immediate because they really shut down the nervous system quickly. So yeah, it does depend, but I think the rule of thumb would be a smaller organism would be more sensitive to these toxins than a larger organism.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for all those great questions. All right, Steph, let's get back to you.
Okay, thank you, Bill, and thank you, Chris, for such an excellent presentation today. So that does conclude our program for today. I hope you enjoyed the fourth program in the Itasca Waters Practical Water Wisdom series. Itasca Waters sincerely thanks Dr. Chris Filstrup for today's excellent program. We thank Bill Granchis for hosting the Q&A portion, and thanks to Itasca Waters board member Kathy Cohn for handling the Q&A background work. And thanks to you for having the interest in clean water and taking the time to be here today. Many thanks to the Itasca Waters Education Committee and its partners for all that they've done to produce today's program, as well as those to follow through the year. Today's program was recorded and will soon be available on our website, itascawaters.org. Feel free to tell your friends and neighbors about it. We will be emailing you an evaluation soon. I know it seems hard to think evaluations matter when our speaker was so excellent today, but there is information on the evaluation that will help us plan for future programs. So please take a moment to complete it. Our next live program will be at noon on August 4th, entitled Understanding Minnesota's Changing Climate. You won't want to miss this, and you can sign up right now by going to our website, itascawaters.org. I'm Stephanie Kessler. Thank you, and see you on August 4th.